Douglas County Community Access Television presents the Regional Report, issues of interest in a complex world, with Regional Reporter Steve Teshara. And now, with today's program, here's Steve Teshara.
And welcome back to our studio here at the Gill Professional Building in Round Hill, Zephyr Cove, Nevada at Lake Tahoe. Our guest today, Chuck Blanchard, was formerly educated in linguistics, philosophy, and music theory. He taught at some schools for many years and was a great teacher. In fact, I think he still is a teacher in many ways. But he ultimately wound up working in survey archaeology and honky-tonk piano, a great combination. He learned these trades in the early 1970s, playing piano in the red light district of Amsterdam and volunteering in archaeological expeditions out in the, is it Balearic Islands?
Balearic Islands,
Balearic
yes.
Islands, and that's in the northwest Spanish Mediterranean. He returned to the United States later in the 1970s with a plan to find two U.S. locations threatened by development and in need of good archaeological maps, places that could also support a living for him playing saloon piano music. So you triangulated around the country, and in 1977 and 78, Chuck pinpointed the likely candidates: the southwest coast of Florida, in the Sarasota area, and the north central Sierra Nevada in and around Lake Tahoe. And that's what brings us to today.
Indeed.
He spent the late 1970s through the mid-80s creating archaeological site maps in Florida and in the Central Sierra, and in 1985 contacted the legitimate anthropological communities in both of the regions. He was subsequently hired by the University of Florida for winter work and by the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit of the U.S. Forest Service for summer work here at the lake, and has spent the last 30 years devotedly contributing to the archaeological knowledge of both regions. At Tahoe, he played piano for a number of years at the Loft and at Captain John's in Kings Beach. His first big archaeological gig at the lake was the 1988 and 89 Tahoe Archaeological Shoreline Survey, or TASS, whose results have just recently been digitized by California State Parks. Is that right?
Yes.
And 7 years ago, Chuck and his wife, Sarah, who's here with us in the studio today, moved to Gardnerville, Nevada, where they currently and merrily reside. And as far as our connection, I first met Chuck when he was in the piano playing mode at the Loft in Kings Beach in 1978.
So long ago.
Yeah, it's not that long ago, really. So I was running a recording studio here on the North Shore, and I can't remember exactly how we connected, but Chuck asked me to come and record some of his sessions at the Loft in Kings Beach, which I did, and I still have. And it was great fun, and I didn't know at the time about your archaeological expertise.
Well, I was keeping it a secret.
You kind of were, actually.
Well, I was, as a matter of fact. I didn't know whether what I was doing was legal even, but I was trying to, I was mapping, essentially, and I was identifying what we call sensitivity sites. That job has evolved into a way of warning people to build somewhere else or to put the road somewhere else and save themselves a world of trouble. Particularly in the Native American communities, very often the fact that there is something there still on the surface might imply human remains below, and that complicates everything for everyone.
Right. So as we said, the first big archaeological work that you did for the Forest Service at Lake Tahoe was actually somewhat of a similar period because the water in the lake was very low.
Right.
And so certain sites along the shore could be accessed that might not normally be accessible. And of course, you being a very foremost canoe person, so you also, in addition to hiking around, you access some of the locations by canoe. Is that right?
I was born in a canoe, as a matter of fact, truth be told. Yes, and I figured there were a lot of places that were too difficult to access around the lake any other way but by water. And so I brought the canoe to bear, and the Forest Service, which employed me at that time, provided me with a canoe.
Oh, great. A government canoe.
They kept it down in Myers.
Really?
A long way from water.
That's odd.
Well, I guess the water was that high at one point.
I don't know. I don't know about that one.
Well,
Maybe
actually,
a tall tale.
After during the Great Ice Bridge in Squaw Valley during the glacial period, Myers was underwater.
Okay.
Yeah.
That goes back a ways, though.
It does, yeah.
I have a picture here that I brought out of my file this morning, which is actually the front page of the Tahoe Daily Tribune in September of 1988, which is a picture and a nice story by then writer Jim DePeso. We both knew Jim.
Good man.
And it's a
Very
little
good
feature
man.
about Chuck Blanchard and the work that he was doing at the time on the shoreline survey. And so I know that that was a really important piece of work because no one had done a shoreline survey at Tahoe for many years. Is that?
I don't think they ever had.
Ever had?
Certainly not a low water survey. And we actually came up with a grand total of some 243 new sensitivity areas, many historical, but many prehistoric as well, that had never been documented
And you
before.
did a report that documented all that, yes?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Is this some of the notes from the?
Yeah, actually, the notes have recently. Oh, you might as well see. I put this on the side of my truck so that I could look legitimate, even though I might not be. And I often said to nude bathers that I was interrupting your tax dollars at work. Right. Oh, sorry. Let me get this. This is what the new notes look like now, though. I mean,
They're all digitized.
I don't know how quite to do this, but I myself am quite impressed with this.
So this is what was digitized off your original work.
Right, and all those numbers, if you can see them, that are in red, were all additions to the knowledge of the lake in terms of cultural resources.
So after the successful completion of the shoreline survey, the Forest Service had some other work for you. Is that right?
Yes, they had a document that had produced a lot of maps. The document was made in 1963 by a combination of interview with elderly Washoe and a anthropological researcher by the name of Stanley Freed from Columbia University. And the elderly Washoe that they mostly interviewed was blind. So he was only able to describe the places that he considered to be sensitive when he was a child, places that he'd visited as a child. So they brought in a ranger from the Forest Service also with a topo map who tried to approximate on the map itself what the actual locus was for these sites. I think there were something like 40 of them before it was all done, 38 or 40.
All around the lake?
Right. And no aspersions being cast on either the ranger or the elderly blind Native American person who was putting the information down, but they were usually about a quarter of a mile off.
So then later you were actually brought in to go out to those sites and to actually pinpoint the location in person.
That was the game plan, and I thought it was going to turn out to be very, very simple, but in fact, it took a long time, and it took a lot of begging to get into private property, and much of what the old fellow had remembered was really not very easy to find. It was at very least under a great deal of pine duff. And so instinct began to play a part. What was the most useful clue was that the old fellows had spoken in Washoe, and they managed at one point to bring in Dr. D'azevedo to help explain the translations of the place names that he was using. And the place names frequently had a description of the area that he was trying to describe, rather he was trying to identify. And often there was sunlight in the afternoon on a bank of a stream or whatever like this, which gave you a direction and the side of the stream that people would be sitting on. And just the general layout of the site, and that was the great help.
It's really like reading moon runes. You can only read the moon runes if you're in the light of the same moon that they were written on, kind of thing. So I guess that's what's always impressed me about your abilities, because I've been in the field with you with archaeologists, and your instinct, your ability to kind of go right to the place to triangulate the clues that you were just talking about to find those things. I thought that was always very extraordinary.
Well, I appreciate you noticing it, Steve. And I know we have spent some wonderful times in the field where I've set Stephen up for a discovery, or one of our archaeological colleagues. I would like to mention that I had a trick up in the high country that I only went up on very, very windy days. And noted in the map and triangulated in on little areas that were not being blown about by the wind on windy days. In other words, windless. And
that's where people would go.
99% of them were sites. That was one of the things I was able to do.
People were going there to seek shelter from the wind.
Right, or to do work on a windy day. Or where do you put the kids?
Right.
Any number of things. Don't blow off the mountain.
So over the years, you've done additional survey work with various archaeologists, both private sector and work for the Forest Service and others. And some of those are fairly recent too, like Angora Creek restoration or Upper Truckee.
The Upper Truckee restoration projects. Probably the next to most recently would be the outlet at Lake Tahoe.
Lake Tahoe Dam?
At the Tahoe Dam, which not only was the bridge tender's cabin basically, was it moved?
Yeah.
It was actually moved, right. All of that had to be cleared. The ground had to be cleared for different loci and so forth and so on. That was great. Also, an awful lot of work that had to do with the various dry periods that we had, you know, where alpine meadows and the ridges above alpine had to be cleared for cultural resource material because they wanted to expand the ski toes, the ski runs and so forth and so on. And that took a lot of work, and I was able to work with some of the very, very best people. I think, of course, always first of Susan Lindstrom, who was a mentor to me in many, many ways, and still is. And she valued my ability to suss out sites and so forth and so on. So she used me as a scout shamelessly. I mean, you know, sent me into all kinds of horrible situations. And
like the guy riding point. Right?
Like the guy riding point, indeed. Our backyards too, you know.
And then I know there was some, in your line of work, an occasional encounter with wildlife, like the bear who took out your camera. Is that
right? Well, actually, one of the more interesting ongoing deals was the Forest Service had a lot of parcels. The Forest Service went from owning a lot of land up here to selling in places, public lands and so forth. And they all had to be cleared of archaeological significance before they could be sold or mitigated in some way, shape, or form. And they would give me a map of parcels in a difficult area like Upper Blackwoods Canyon or something like this, and send me in for 2 or 3 days, and I would go in for 2 or 3 days and get in there early and find what I could, map it in, and come back. And one particular morning, I heard the thunder of hoofbeats coming down a hill, coming down to Blackwoods Creek, and I thought, must be a very large deer, but it wasn't.
No?
It was a large bear instead, a cinnamon phase California black bear with a little bear behind. A little kid with him, and or her rather, and she took a look at me and her eyes went cold, did not care that I was a good scout or that I could play honky-tonk piano or anything else like that. Came down the ditch and right up into my face swinging. And one of the few times in my life my knees absolutely went to water, just like they say, and I I didn't faint, but I started to lose muscular control, and she swung and whacked my camera.
There it went.
And it went off my neck and down into the stream, and that was it. And I'm happy to say that, to their credit, the Forest Service replaced my camera for that close encounter.
Well, we mentioned in the opening that Chuck and his wife Sarah live now in Gardnerville, and when we come back for the second segment of our show today, we're going to look at some things that Chuck has that have come right out of their property down in the Carson Valley. So stay tuned for that, and we'll be right back with you after this short break.
The Regional Report receives support from the Gill Professional Building, Lake Tahoe's most professional business location, 218 Elks Point Road, Round Hill, Zephyr Cove, Nevada. Professional office suites now available. Get information at 775-588-2488 or on the web at gillprofessionalbuilding.com.
And we are back with our guest today, Chuck Blanchard, and we talked a little bit about his work at Tahoe. Now we're going to move into the Carson Valley, and Chuck has an assemblage of tools to show us and talk a little bit about human presence way back when in the Carson Valley, before Chuck and Sarah moved there, certainly. But there's a lot of cultural history in the Carson Valley.
There is indeed, and all of the materials that I'm going to show you, with some exceptions, come from our backyard. Because of the water shortage, we had an extension of the ditch that we are actually on for irrigation in our property, and we dug a deeper ditch at a different angle and came down across the bank of what had been an old part of the Carson River itself. The actual East Branch used to run through our backyard.
I guess the river has moved around over some period
Yes,
of time.
over a number of years. Actually, we found that up on the Upper Truckee too. There were many, many false leads as to what had been the river. So when they went to restore it, it was an interesting problem.
Where do we restore it?
Yeah, which do we restore?
Which do we restore it?
Right. Well, anyhow, it was pretty easy that my property is surrounded in part by an 1863 barbed wire fence also, which delineates the limit of my property down toward the watershed. So it was easy to see where the stream of the Carson River East Branch had gone at one time or another. And when we dug the ditch, right on the lip of the ditch in what had been a bank, which probably had, I'd say a river bank, which had cottonwoods growing on it and people sitting with their feet in the water, who knows how long ago, a series of artifacts, both historic and prehistoric, began to appear in the backfill of the ditch. And
with your keen eye, you knew what they were.
Well, I knew what they were because that had been my job for a long time. And in fact, I think there used to be something called an IPS rule, a series of IPS rules up there on the lake, which required a certain amount of obsidian to produce an Indian site, or to guarantee an Indian. It seemed to me as though it was something like that was going on. Anyway, this was definitely a Native American site, probably a home site. And as they came out, I began to get a picture of all that, and then I looked into the records to find out who might have lived within walking distance of the river and of the escarpment, the Carson Range escarpment, who might have been responsible for this treasure trove of artifacts, and discovered that there had been a tremendous early washoe presence right along the foot of the mountain, and that they had been subject to destructive avalanches over time, so that rather than having a South Carson Valley name, or as the Woodford's component does now, or a North Carson Valley names, such as the folks on the other side of Carson, where the highway has just gone through. Was it
580?
580, sorry.
That's all right.
There's a huge site up there, so there was a big settlement there. We were part of a little settlement that where the people had the name of they who live under the mountain, or under the shadow of the mountain. And it was a name that also had a certain amount of sorrow attached to it, because even the locus of Genoa, which had, and Wally's Hot Springs, which had a large population, or a much larger population from time to time, these people had been killed in avalanches, and people wouldn't move back to certain areas. So they had no formal name except the folks who aren't there anymore.
The folks who aren't there anymore.
Yeah.
So some of this, do you think, was from that?
Well, yes, I think so. I think in part because I can get a relative age for some of the things. Now, this is what they call a mono, a hand stone for milling grass seed or pine nuts or what have you. And
It's pretty smooth on the top.
it has a very smooth surface, what we call a cultural surface, because it has been granite, rubbed on granite for so long that it's created a very slick patina there. The back of it is where they held it in their hand, and
Right.
like that there.
It's beautiful.
Yes, it is actually, and very heavy. And these two guys are hammerstones, so-called hammerstones. They're, this one is granite, as this other thing is, and has a certain amount of cultural wear from where it was used to crack acorns or pine nuts. And this one is interesting to me because in the museum, in the Alpine Museum down in Woodford, south of Woodford's, Markleeville, that wonderful little museum down there, there is a stone tool, a hammer, in fact, that is exactly the same material. And I've been able to trace it to the mudslide stone that's all over the road, you know, the sides of the road down there. So this was gathered somewhere within the watershed of the Carson River, which, by the way, also has a name down there. It is elaborately, I can't pronounce Washoe names, I really can't. I would embarrass myself and I would embarrass my Washoe friends if I tried. But what it means essentially is where the river comes out of the canyon and splits in two directions. And
There's a Washoe name for that.
There's a Washoe name for that. Actually, the great Penny Rux, who is the new ethnographer of the Washoe, told me that Slide Mountain had a name also, which was essentially, don't walk underneath this mountain.
They were ever so practical in how they named things.
Don't walk underneath this mountain because it will fall on you and crush you like a bug. She said it's something like that.
Very practical.
Yeah,
very descriptive.
Right on the money too. Okay, so those, they can be any time really, but they're, considering the context of the other things, they're probably much older than the last things I'll show you.
Okay.
These are artifacts of chert. Can you see them? I'm not sure whether they can be seen on this
cloth.
On this
not
cloth,
the ankle,
probably not. But this is very typical of domestic occupation. These are hand drills designed for putting a hole in leather or putting a hole in any number of things, you know. Moccasins.
Yeah, that looks particularly pointy.
Right,
there,
and they're thumb artifacts.
You could work them like that.
They're rough, and they're made out of, you know, crudely made out of chert. I say crudely. They're, you know, there's no accidents out there. These things are very well made, in fact, but they look a little bit cruder, and they aren't the finished drills that you might see, say, up in Squaw Valley, for instance. But they're very, very functional. They work. You get your thumb on one side, and
oh, I could see that.
yeah. So those folks, and these are, this is what they call a flake tool. It's a biface, that is to say it's worked on both sides, and was probably just a little ad hoc cutting tool. Who knows what for? Probably not food, oriented with food, but maybe reed splitting or any number of things like that. And this is a little chert core. And incidentally, I've had a superb lithics expert, stone tool expert by the name of William Bloomer, who's my neighbor down there in the Carson Valley, pass on all of these and tell me more about them. And this is, not only was this some sort of a cutting edge tool at one point, but then it was sort of cannibalized for other tools. So it became what is known as a core tool. At any rate, these are all much older. These are probably in the 2,000 to 4,000 year range. At least they appear to go into that realm.
And all from your property.
Right. And on the upper part of the bank, there are actually still some things that are more historic and definitely newer. One of them is a broken bow and arrow point. Bow and arrow was a much later arrival with the Washoe and the Indians of the valley, and it's made out of Bodie Hills obsidian.
From the Bodie area?
From the Bodie area, and that is definitely imported, and it was a material of choice of the later time. And to really knock down the the historic side of it, this is a beat up old ox shoe, which I'm sure the Saturday morning flea market collectors, see a lot of that,
Right.
that stuff. That elderly bar, that old bar in Genoa used to have a lot of those sitting on tables, and they're covered with dust and cobwebs and so forth and so on. But that dates, of course, to the occupation. I mean, the early white Euro-American occupation of the valley, which was basically settled by ox trains.
Right.
Okay.
So that's amazing. So and obviously this speaks to how many years that the Carson Valley area has been occupied.
At least 4K, at least 4K, I would say, at this stage in the game, and perhaps more. I just haven't seen any documentation of much older Native American occupation, but up and around and in the surrounding areas, for instance, the Cap Richardson area, there's material from 8,000 to 9,000 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and at the outlet, 5,000 years.
Interesting. So there's a lot of history in the Carson Valley from over
Yes, indeed.
many years, and I know it's probably the more recent stuff is more well documented, but are there museums or are there any other places where people can go and see some of the range of things?
I think that for instance, the Alpine Museum, the Alpine County Museum in Markleeville is very good for its size, particularly, and it's right on the edge of Woodford's, so they are held to account by a resident Native American group there who definitely don't want bogus representation there. So I was very impressed with what they had of the Washoe presence there. And of course the bridge tenders place, the Basket Museum.
The Basket Museum in Tahoe City,
which is a world-class operation, absolutely wonderful.
Well, we mentioned at the beginning of the show that Chuck was doing parallel work in the Sarasota, Florida area, and we want to show a couple of things there because this is stone technology.
Stone technology, right.
Stone tools, and in Florida they had very different materials to work with.
The Southwest Florida did not have any large tool stone available, so they made the local Native Americans made their tools out of whelk shells, edible carnivorous snail shell. So this is a piece of whelk shell that has been broken into a preform so that axes or blades can be
made from that.
What's the word? Napped from it. So you're looking at something vastly different in terms of the technology. And my good friend Bloomer has just been fascinated by this. He came down and spent a winter one. So
and then you have some other tools.
yeah, this is
Assemble at your own risk.
this is a magic trick.
What are these?
These are hammers, much like those little
These ones here, hammer stones.
hammer stones.
These are hammer shells.
These are hammer shells. They're to be used this way. This is a standard tool in a series of artifacts that number well over 125 or 30 different tool types made out of shell in that part of the world. That's what I learned down there, and that's for another time, another story.
Chuck's a published author, has written 4 different books. There's one on the gold country in California, and there's a couple based on his work in Florida. So it's been a pleasure having you
Stephen,
as our guest on the show.
Such a delight.
Thank
really.
you for bringing all these, and thank
My
you for
pleasure.
the wonderful stories about your work here and also the honky-tonk piano career, which is a favorite part of mine as well. So we appreciate you viewing here on Douglas County Community Access Television, and we'll see you again next time for another edition of the Regional Report.
You've been watching the Regional Report with Regional Reporter Steve Teshara. Studio location provided by the Gill Professional Building, 218 Elks Point Road, Round Hill, Zephyr Cove, Lake Tahoe. Graphic design and titles by Charter Advertising Design. Announcer Ed Miller, Wild West Communications. Production by Lloyd Higuera and Douglas County Community Access Television.